Okay, well thanks for inviting me along to give the talk tonight. So my name is Healan and I work at the Planning Delivery team at Cornwall Council. The topic I was asked to give a bit of a talk around is an area that I've been doing a bit of work in for the last few years, mainly relating to the Cornwall local plan and more recently the neighbourhood planning activity, which is sort of taking off not just in Cornwall but across the country really. And just a bit about sort of the localism agenda and how that's affecting planning and the built environment. So the things I was going to talk through tonight, just a bit of a sort of agenda if you like, some recent changes to the planning system in the country, a bit about that, a bit of update about the Cornwall local plan itself, its next steps and the role of that in terms of its broad role, and then focusing on what the local plan means or what some of its intentions are for the St Ives and Healan sort of community network area, so more specifically looking at this area geographically. And then I'll talk a bit about neighbourhood planning, because I know neighbourhood planning activity in St Ives is taking off, so a bit about that. Not lots of detail, but again a bit of a broad overview, and perhaps the relationship with neighbourhood planning and the Cornwall local plan, the more sort of strategic plan, and how we see that perhaps working. And then I'll just sort of end with a few thoughts on terms of the localism agenda. You know, localism has become quite a popular word in the last few years, and how that's affecting the planning system, the built environment. And a few thoughts there, which aren't necessarily Cornwall Council's thoughts, but are just some of my thoughts as someone working in the sort of built environment and planning sort of arena, really. And I've put discussion and questions at the end, but I'm quite happy that as we go through the presentation, if anyone wants to, if there's something that's not clear, to question it, or we can have a bit of discussion about it as we go through the slides. I'm happy to do it that way as well, so up to yourselves really. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with the local plan or the planning system in much detail, whether you've had any dealings with it, so if there is anything that I'm rambling away about that you think, well, what's he talking about, please butt in and we can sort of perhaps try and explain it rather than me just carrying on. Okay. So just some recent changes to the planning system in the country that you may be aware of. I'm sure you're aware of some of them, is that the current government brought in what's called the National Planning Policy Framework. So a document which is 59 pages in length, and that document replaced thousands of pages of sort of technical documents and guidance that planners and others were using to sort of make decisions in the built environment. So quite a change in terms of the emphasis there, in terms of information that's used to sort of make decisions. The government also have removed regional plans. There was a tier of plans called regional spatial strategies, and there was also lots of national planning guidances, and they've been removed, and that fits in with the government sort of agenda of saying, putting decision making down to the localism, you know, at the local tier level, local authorities, parish and town councils. But with that, there's also been a pro-growth theme, sort of a pro-growth agenda with the recession over recent years. The government are very keen to sort of loosen the reins, if you like, and try and get things happening. So the localism agenda emphasises the role and importance of the local plan, that's Cornwall-wide, in determining housing, employment, retail, infrastructure, and the locations perhaps where they should be over a broad area. But also there's the opportunity within these changes to undertake neighbourhood planning, which I know some of you probably, I recognise a few faces in the room, are probably involved in the neighbourhood plan work in St Ives. But again, the government has said, you know, that neighbourhood planning should be about pro-growth and making things happen and shaping the change that will happen, rather than something to say, you know, we don't want anything to happen and we've got a plan to say that. So the few things that are happening there, it's very much an evolving system, and I think it's probably going to take a while to bed in, and for all of us to get used to. I think planners, developers, the community, it's definitely an evolving system. This is a diagram, it's a bit of a conceptual plan, concept plan taken from the local plan. Some of you may have seen it, and what it broadly does, it's a bit of a strategy for Cornwall-wide, and it sets out where the key settlements are, sort of the big blobs, and the bigger the blob, you know, for example, you've got sort of St Austell, Truro, the Camel, Poole, Redruth urban area, and some of those areas to signify where the main sort of town settlements are, and in turn where some of the growth over the next sort of 15, 70 years may be directed as development happens. We've also got the key main A30, the main route, the rail line in terms of transport and infrastructure. And so it's just a bit of a conceptual diagram which we put in the local plan to say this illustrates some of the information that's in this plan about changes in Cornwall, but you can't really see it that clearly on that board, so it's probably, yeah, it's a concept plan anyway, so it doesn't provide a lot of detail, but it just gives you an overall idea of where the local plan is pitched at. It's perhaps a bit different from older plans that had a lot more detail and lines and specific details on maps. So about the local plan. The local plan has been rumbling on for a few years now, but so we're happy to say it's getting there now towards where we hopefully will have a position where we'll have an adopted plan in Cornwall. It's the local plan is at the submissions draft. It's been through already 2 rounds of consultation over the last few years. And very recently, this month in fact, Cornwall Council, full council agreed the submission draft local plan. And what will happen is that will be reconsulted on for one final time for some changes in it based on some of the feedback that was had at a previous consultation. And it will go out to a final consultation period for 6 weeks, which is due to be in March. Once that's happened, that plan will then get sent off to the Secretary of State, along with any comments that come back, and it will be examined in public. And there'll be an examination in public where people can go along, whether it's community or developers or agencies, and say whether they agree with the way the plan has been formulated. And that will happen in autumn 2014 is the intention. Sorry, early 2015 is the examination. If all's being well and that independent planning inspector says the Cornwall local plan has been prepared the right way, people have had involvement in it, made comments, the plan has been amended subsequently, Cornwall Council will then be able to adopt a plan. We're looking mid-2015. So it's quite a lengthy process considering it's already been going on for a few years already. But at that stage, that will be when Cornwall Council and Cornwall has an adopted local plan, and it will have what's called more weight in planning decisions in terms of determining sort of where development may go, and if people put in applications, a plan that sort of will be used to determine those. Just a few key sort of figures in that local plan. Some of you may be aware of some of them, or you may not. In terms of, it sets out broadly for Cornwall, so quite strategically, the amount of employment space over a long time frame. So this is up to 2030. A lot of it we have to use is based on evidence and projections, but as you can imagine, it's not to the exact, we're not exact sure that's what we require, but we have to have some evidence and an estimate of what we think we may need, and then the plan is monitored annually, and if things change, it's amended. So in terms of new homes, around 47,000 new homes to meet both existing and predicted housing requirements in Cornwall, through the need for affordable homes, social trends with people living longer, more people living alone, and so forth. The main towns, as I've said, settlements will be a focus for new development because that's where a lot of the services and facilities and infrastructure are. But there will also be development in the more rural areas in Cornwall, in some of the villages, because around 50% of the population in Cornwall actually lives outside in the main towns, and some of the smaller settlements perform an important role in terms of some of the facilities that they provide. So there will be development in the main towns as a focus, but also development in other areas. Affordable housing, obviously a huge issue in Cornwall. The policy in there at the moment is if there's a proposal for 2 or more dwellings, then an affordable housing policy will kick in, if you like. And that's to ensure that we can provide affordable housing for the community. And that will be based on sort of viability in terms of the development and the values in the area. St Ives is one of the areas where, in terms of those negotiations, the starting point is 50% for affordable housing, and that's because St Ives is a popular area, the land values are very high, so in terms of viability you're able to aim for more affordable housing. So the local plan is also about infrastructure, and there's a document alongside it called an infrastructure delivery plan, and what this does is it's been prepared, work with Cornwall Council coordinated, but working with sort of key agencies and infrastructure providers, the Education Authority, utilities. And what happens is they say, well, if this is how Cornwall may change over the next 10, 15 years, and this is how how much new development we think may occur, and what the population may be, what does that mean for schools? What does it mean for the Health Authority? What does it mean for play spaces, sports facilities, and the highways infrastructure? And then that means that all the providers can sit around the table and say, well, if that's how Cornwall's going to change, have we got enough capacity in the schools? If so here, then fine. If not, we need to start planning for that now. We need to get their plans in line so the Cornwall local plan is aligned with infrastructure delivery. So a big undertaking, but a hugely important aspect of the local plan. I think it's not just about homes or buildings, it's actually about the infrastructure as well. So there are some other planning documents as well that will be part of the Cornwall development plan. You've got the Cornwall local plan, which is very broad policy sort of messages about Cornwall. There will also be what's called a site allocations plan, and what that will look to do, which is being prepared at the moment, is the Cornwall local plan may say, okay, we need 47,000 houses in Cornwall, and they may be in these locations, but the local plan has to be deliverable, and we'll have to demonstrate how that plan will be delivered. So if we need to provide this much employment space, or a new retail space in a town, or this much new housing, we're going to have to allocate some areas for those homes or jobs or new shops to go. And if we don't do that, then the local plan, it's not a deliverable plan. So there are more elements to the local plan just than the main document. Some other plans, there's something called a mineral safeguarding plan. That's about minerals extraction, safeguarding quarries. Again, that's something else Cornwall Council, from a planning perspective, have to have a role in. Affordable housing will have its own document specifically because it's such an important issue in Cornwall. So there'll be what's called a supplementary planning document providing more detail about the delivery of affordable housing and just try and enable that. Renewable energy guidance as well, a hugely important area. There's lots of solar farms cropping up, wind farms, always a contentious issue. So there's some guidance needed on that in terms of Cornwall, because Cornwall is ideally located for renewable energy, but with our landscape as well, you've got that tension. And then the Cornwall Design Guide. You've got a colleague of mine, Dave Slatter, coming along to talk about that in more detail. So it's not my area in particular, so I won't talk about that, but Dave will go through that when he comes, perhaps in more detail in terms of Cornwall Design Guide, what it says, what its intentions are. And then we've got neighbourhood plans, which I'll come on to perhaps in a bit more detail with a few slides in a minute. But neighbourhood plans now fit in with these other documents, if you like. They've got a role to play in terms of becoming part of the development plan of Cornwall. If a community wishes to undertake one, if it's got the involvement of the wider community, goes through a referendum and is subsequently adopted, it can become part of the development plan and have an influence in the decision-making process. So a number of documents make up the plan, if you like, the development plan for Cornwall. Again, it doesn't, not completely clear on the screen, but like I showed that sort of concept plan for Cornwall a minute ago, this is zoomed in, and what you've got is the community network area for St Ives and Hale. So you've got the St Ives and Hale, the bay here, you've got Hale over here and St Ives over here. And again, that's just an extract from the local plan which focuses on this area specifically. And on there you've got the main routes, again you've got the rail line, the A30, and then you've got the national important designations. So you've got the World Heritage Site, you've got the AONB, SSSIs, flood zones 2 and 3. So those important environmental assets and areas which are probably no-go for development and change in some areas, or if there is going to be change, it needs to be handled very sensitively and mitigated. They're on there to show that broadly, in this area, these are the areas of the sort of national designations and higher environmental importance. And then again, you've got the main settlements, St Ives, Carlos Bay and Hale, got the bigger sort of blobs on in terms of their role as towns and where development may go, but also you've got some of the outlying sort of villages on there. So I don't know whether any of you have actually looked at the local plan in terms of what it says about this area, but it broadly sets out some objectives for the Hale and St Ives community network area, what the aspirations are for this area in the future moving forward for homes and jobs. There's a bit of text about the towns, so both the St Ives and Carlos Bay area and the Hale, there's a bit more text about how the role they may play in the future. And then it sets out for the network area the number of homes that we think we may need to plan for, and breaks it down into a number for the towns and then the rest of the rural area, if you like, some of the villages. And again, it touches on what key infrastructure we think in this community network area may be a focus for improvements, whether it's the schools or the roads.
Are you in a position to separate out what is related to St Ives and what is related to Hale in relation to dwellings?
Yeah, I think it's either the next slide or the slide after. I'll come on to it and we can look at that. But so in terms of the number of dwellings, and again, I probably didn't say earlier on, the plan period for the local plan, we're already into it. It started in 2010 and it runs to 2030. And so within that time frame, the evidence is suggesting we need to perhaps plan for around 2,700 dwellings in the community network area. So just for comparison, and that's over a 20-year period, so for comparison, in a 10-year period, excuse me, between 1991 and the end of 2010, just over 2,200 dwellings were built in the area. So that was a 10-year period. Sorry, I've got other slides somewhere that are a 10-year period, I promise. So in comparison, I'll change what I was just going to say in the next slide. You can see that it's not too different in terms of the build rate in this network area. And in some areas that may be the case in Cornwall, where you could call it, the business as usual trend. In other areas it may drop, and in other areas it may go up where there's capacity for more change. Okay, so this is the slide that breaks it down a bit more detail to what it says for where that development, the balance of development will go. So in St Ives, the local plan is suggesting around 1,000 homes. In Hale, it's saying around 1,400. And then outside of the main towns, for the rest of sort of rural area and the network area, if you like, around 350 homes. But you may see at the end I've put some figures. So for St Ives there, it's got 300. Because what that means is essentially that of those 1,000 homes, there's already around 600 homes that are either been built since 2010, are being built, or have planning permission. So a number of them are actually in the pipeline, if you like, or exist today. So although you may think 1,000 homes, in reality, we include the ones that are already in the pipeline, and when you look at it, it's not that many. It's not 1,000 in total remaining to be built. Similarly for Hale Harbour has got permission. While there hasn't been any dwellings built yet, the intention is there will be with permission. So a large number of the homes in Hale will come through on the Hale Harbour scheme, the regeneration scheme. And again, with the network area, you can see remaining to be built. There's already a number that have been built.
Marcus, could you just clarify the implication of your figures is that the Lant and Hallstown are not included in the St Ives area housing targets? Is that clearly the case?
Yeah, the St Ives target itself just applies really to the built urban area of St Ives and Carbis Bay.
Oh, so it does include Carbis Bay?
Yeah.
Okay.
But the Lant, Harlestown and the rural area, that would come under the sort of the rest of the network area, if you like.
Can I just ask, what's your definition of a home?
So it's
one
one dwelling.
Yeah,
one dwelling. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of the rest of the network area, whether it's the village or the rural area, that development, it may just occur, applications to build new housing, or it could be, an affordable scheme, or it could be through neighbourhood planning activity. And the suggestion is if there's different areas in the rest of the network area, whether it's the Lant or St Earth, that are looking to prepare a neighbourhood plan and want to deliver some homes and employment, then there's the need for that coordination and that discussion, if you like, between the different sort of councils in the area. The last slide is just to show you, in terms of the affordable homes, the current need in St Ives, there's a register called the Home Choice Register, which Cornwall Council keeps, and at the moment there's just over 600 families on the Home Choice Register that have a local connection to the St Ives area in need of affordable home. So you can see in terms of that's current need, that's projected to rise in the future. In terms of the number of dwellings we're looking to provide, if you do it to St Ives, I think there's a recognition you're not going to provide all the affordable homes that a community needs, and that, that's not just here. That's been many communities, in Cornwall or across the country, simply because the need for affordable homes is so great, and it is such an issue. But the number of homes that we'll provide will make a contribution to that. Just some of the key issues in the community network area, which I'm sure you're more than aware of them. And again, these are just fleshed out in the local plan, in the network area, and some of the objectives. Hale, in some of the work that's been done, generally it's felt it has more capacity moving forward for development and change than perhaps St Ives in the future. The topography of St Ives, how constrained it is physically with the built environment. Hale, you've got a bit more sort of breathing space around it in terms of perhaps for change to happen, and that's perhaps reflected in the build rate in this area historically has been higher than it has in Hale. In St Ives, you've got a very successful town centre in relation to the tourism industry, comparative to some of the other towns of a similar scale in Cornwall. St Ives is quite a vibrant town centre. However, there's limited opportunity for what you would call formal large sort of employment space, industrial space in St Ives, again because of the way that the settlement is built and the topography. Role of tourism, I said, is hugely important. You've got the arts and the culture industry, high house prices, second holiday homes, and then traffic and movement issues. We're doing a bit of work with some of the local members over the recent last few years in St Ives. Traffic and movement always comes up, particularly, as you're all aware, particularly through different times of the year. So issues in terms of how, with St Ives moving forward. In terms of the broader area, this network area, the Hale Harbour regeneration proposals are a key regeneration proposal within this area, but also Cornwall-wide as well. There's proposals, the first phase of which is just happening on the Hale Harbour, which is a retail proposal on South Quay. And then you've got the North Quay aspect with what's called a marine renewables business park with new office and industrial space, homes, leisure, mix of uses, all in that sort of waterside location. So a significant regeneration proposal, I think, within the context of Cornwall, which is happening, perhaps not in this town, but very nearby in the Hale St Ives area. There are highways issues, perhaps more so strategic ones, with the A30 around Hale, with the A30 junctions there and some infrastructure works required. And climate change, sea level rise is going to be an issue in this area. The causeway in St Ives, there's a document called the Shoreline Management Plan, which looks at, in the next sort of 25, 50 years, which areas are going to need improvement or which areas do you need let go with sea level rise. There could be some issues with the causeway in Hale, and equally the St Ives seafront is an area where more work needs to be done. So town framework plans, some of you may be familiar with town framework plans, or you may not. Essentially, there's some work within the local plan sort of context, if you like. When Cornwall started doing its local plan, it was recognised that compared to some other authorities, Cornwall is quite a broad area with a lot of different settlements. And to plan for that, one big plan, we recognise we need to perhaps have a number of plans within the key settlements to help inform what the big plan says overall, if you like. So that's where town frameworks came from. They really sort of started work just before neighbourhood planning activity started to take off. So a local member steering group was set up in each of the. They were set up in all of Cornwall's main towns. I should say that first. There was a local member steering group with elected members on it, representatives from the town council. And what we did is we met every 6 weeks and we sat down and we said, well, okay, if the local plan is thinking about the change for Cornwall over the next 20 years, how do we think St Ives should change? What are the issues? How do we translate that to some text in the local plan, and what do we say about retail and homes, etc. So they were very useful documents to help us inform the local plan. There's a vision in there and some objectives, and then it says what we think employment areas may come forward in the area. Similarly, retail, and we've just talked about that, it's constrained in St Ives, and again with housing. And also it looks at infrastructure in terms of the schools, the transport, the open spaces. In terms of, there was a framework for St Ives and Carbis Bay. It was consulted on alongside the local plan in 2012, and that set out options, and it said to the community, here's some options, do you agree with them? If not, are there other options you think would be better, or is there an option you think perhaps is the best one of the options, if you like? All of those comments were reviewed, worked with the member steering group, and that helped to inform the local plan at the stage it's at now, if you like. Since then, the town frameworks haven't progressed further, but what they are doing is they are informing, you may remember I mentioned the Cornwall Site Allocations DPD, which will allocate sites, particularly in the main towns in Cornwall, to deliver the local plan for Cornwall. So that work is going to inform the site allocations document. And also there's a link with neighbourhood plannings where neighbourhood plans are taking place as well. So I think I've probably already said about the site allocations document that it will allocate sites for housing. Also the town centres, it will show this is the town centre, it may have changed slightly, show the map, or this is the same town centre area for a certain town. And as I just said, the relationship in this area with St Ives neighbourhood plan. Just in terms of a summary of the local plan role, it sets the broad policy direction for Cornwall, but also geographic areas, community network areas and towns, the amount of development, areas to protect, areas for employment and retail, and the infrastructure requirements. In terms of the regional spatial strategy I mentioned, that was abolished by the current government. So although some may not see it this way, the local plan is actually a key element in some ways of localism. The local planning authority sets the context for localism at the town and parish level to undertake neighbourhood planning. So, and just a few thoughts there as well. The local plan is a broad document, it's not very detailed, but it's that framework for change, and as you're all aware, that change happens through the private sector, homeowners, architects and designers, agencies, infrastructure providers, the community, businesses. The real work of delivering on the ground takes place within that sort of debate in that arena, which I'm sure you're all kind of involved in at different levels. And so the local plan is important, but the local plan doesn't build anything in itself. It's just a framework to help guide things. So I don't want to overstate the importance of it in terms of this is going to do this and that. It's a lot of other different people that are involved outside of the local authority in terms of shaping the environment. That was a bit of overview about the local plan and some in relation to this area. We've had some discussion which I think was really good. I've got a few slides on neighbourhood planning as well. I don't know in terms of your time or appetite whether you want to go through the neighbourhood planning aspects slides as well. I can go through them quite quickly if you like. Yep. Okay. So I know some of you are involved in neighbourhood planning in the St Ives area, so you're probably well aware of what it is you're doing and what neighbourhood planning is about. It was introduced by the Localism Act and is referred to in the National Planning Policy Framework, which I mentioned, and there are also detailed neighbourhood planning regulations as well. But essentially it's about enabling the people in an area who care about the area plan for it. It's led by the residential business community. It's not led by Cornwall Council, but it's about building and shaping the neighbourhood. It's not about stopping development. It's about sort of how do we want it to change and how can we shape that. Obviously land use planning, and it has to have the involvement of the wider community. There might be a certain group driving it forward, but it has to at different stages have shown that the wider community have also said that they share the aspirations, those aspirations for the area in the future. And there has to be kind of no conflict with national policy, but also with the Cornwall Council policy as well. And that requires really, as I think I said earlier on, joint working and discussion throughout the process to make sure that the plan is going in the right direction. And yeah, neighbourhood planning is not there to propose less growth than the local plan for Cornwall is setting out. It has to comply, if you like, with the strategic sort of Cornwall plan. But once approved, a neighbourhood plan will become part of the statutory development plan for Cornwall and will have weight in the decision-making process. So if applications come in, an officer might refer to the local plan, but then he would pick up a neighbourhood plan and look at it more specifically about what it says, and that would influence the determining of those planning applications. So it needs to be in general conformity with the development plan, as I've already said, and it has to go through a referendum. So at the end of the process there has to be a referendum on it, and over 50% of the vote have to vote in favour of the plan for it then to go forward to subsequently be adopted. And if you've had the involvement of the community and the different areas of the community throughout the process, then hopefully the referendum should just be a bit of a rubber stamp at the end of it. If there hasn't been that involvement, then there's perhaps more scope for the referendum to go awry. So neighbourhood planning can set out a vision for an area, can set out planning policies, can set out areas for different types of use for land. But it shouldn't stray too much into strategic issues that are perhaps picked up in the Cornwall local plan, but pick up more locally specific issues that perhaps the local plan doesn't have the scope to get involved in. So it could say where perhaps new open space would go, or shops, or some homes, and also which areas of green space are really important and perhaps want to be retained. And also it can add some detail in terms of community infrastructure. What are the priorities? You know, are there community buildings or village halls that perhaps need to be retained for certain uses or need improvement? The community infrastructure levy, just without sort of going into that, if you have community infrastructure levies are charged that the Cornwall Council takes from developers when development is permitted to pay for infrastructure that might be required related to the development. An element of that is to go back to the community, so the town council, 15%. If there's an adopted neighbourhood plan, then that goes up to 25% to help go towards some of the priorities or projects that might be in the neighbourhood plan. The one caveat I would say with that is that at a Cornwall-wide level, the community infrastructure levy is looking pretty sparse in terms of what may be there at a Cornwall-wide level, so don't get your hopes up too much that there'll be significant funds at the local level either for certain areas to fund development. And that simply is just because the infrastructure requirements in certain areas in Cornwall are so great, and development, you know, will not fund all that. There'll need to be other avenues of revenue funding to go towards that. So neighbourhood planning is not new. It can build on existing community planning work. Parish plans have been ongoing for a number of years now. I know St Ives had its MCTI, the Market and Coastal Town Initiative, and I'm sure as you're reviewing those documents, and it can build on that. This is a map from a few years ago which shows community planning activity across Cornwall. So the purple areas and the red areas showed where there was a parish plan or some element of community planning activity in parishes and towns, and where there was a plan completed are the purple ones. So Cornwall, you know, has a great history, tradition of activity, community development, community planning, preparing parish and town documents. This map is January 2014, and it shows neighbourhood planning, so slight difference from parish plans. So these are the neighbourhood planning land use plans, and you've got they look red on the screen? Yeah, red and orange are areas where there is neighbourhood planning activity underway, and the parish or town council have designated their area for neighbourhood planning. So you can see there's a number of areas in Cornwall which are looking to do neighbourhood planning. We haven't got any yet that have got to the stage of a referendum or are adopted, but there's a lot of activity taking place, and because it's a new area, as this practice is taking place, there's a lot of practice that we can share in different areas to see how things are going. There were what's called front runners in neighbourhood planning when neighbourhood planning was introduced a couple of years ago. St Earth was a front runner, and there was a project in Penzance, and then others in Cornwall. Their experience to date has been varied, I think. Is probably there has been some success and they're moving forward, but they've also found it quite challenging, I think, in terms of a new area being introduced. No one quite sure in terms of how to get to the end product, and recognition it takes a lot of enthusiasm and skills and resources in the community to drive a plan forward. So things are still progressing, as you know yourselves in St Ives, those that are involved, but it's not a straightforward process at all. Cornwall has a neighbourhood planning guidance toolkit, which is a useful resource, and some of you may have looked at on the website, and it sets out different steps in neighbourhood planning, references other areas of information that you can look to, and has a bit of a breakdown of sort of individual considerations for developing a plan. A good resource and useful to refer to, I think. Other guidance is available, I'm sure you're more than aware, and other toolkits are all out there. And also, Cornwall Council is there to assist, but there are other bodies and agencies which are heavily involved in neighbourhood planning activity and are there to help provide a steer. As I said a minute ago, resources, enthusiasm, skills, I think are the key things in neighbourhood planning. In terms of moving forward, I think you need that commitment and drive, and if you can get those involved in the community with certain interests or skills to help take it forward, then I think that's a huge benefit, and that will ensure that the plan will move forward successfully. There was a national estimate in terms of the cost of a neighbourhood plan that the government put out a while ago, between 17,000 and 63,000. It was very much, I think, a sort of finger in the air ballpark figure, but that was a national estimate. Some of the feelings is that it might be less in Cornwall, within the Cornwall context. Cornwall Council, there's a referendum, and Cornwall Council has a duty to fund that referendum. Just some experience across, not just Cornwall, but across the country, in terms of, this was taken from Planning Resource, in terms of November 2013, so a few months ago, just over 850 areas had applied for neighbourhood planning designation in the country. 15 of them had gone through their independent examination, and 7 plans had been adopted. I think there was another one just the last few days, that's 8 plans been adopted, all with positive referendums, so they'd had that community involvement through the process and it had been agreed and signed off at the end. So some good adopted plans out there now starting to come through, which we can look to and say, well, what are they doing right? What do they look like? How can we use that? One neighbourhood plan has failed examination, and my understanding is that's in relation to EU regulations called sustainability appraisal, which are appraising the sort of economic, social, environmental benefits or disadvantages of the plan. Some of the activity is concentrated in certain areas. I think the figure was saying there was 130 local authorities in the country that don't have any designations for neighbourhood plans, and there are others where there are real pockets of activity. Hertfordshire, Cornwall, you can see, there's between 40 and 50 designations. So certain areas are really sort of picked it up and running with it and saying, yeah, we want to do this, and other areas doesn't seem to be much happening. Another bit of information that was on there, which was quite interesting, was they were saying across the board the 20 most deprived districts have just 6 designations. The 20 least deprived, so the more affluent areas, have 49 designations. So just in some of the areas that are perhaps moving forward with neighbourhood planning, as you expect sometimes, with same with parish plans and community activity work, sometimes the more affluent areas that perhaps have the interest and the skills to move forward, and some of the other areas that perhaps need a bit of intervention, there's not so much activity taking place at present. So it's still early days, but there's an uneven pattern of neighbourhood activity, I think, across the board, but a lot of interest in Cornwall taking place. Just quickly, I don't want to go on too much about local planning and neighbourhood planning, I'm sure you've kind of heard enough already, but the local plan, just in terms of that relationship with neighbourhood plan, as hopefully I set out earlier, the local plan, broader area considerations and policy, the neighbourhood plan, more focused spatially in terms of village or town, or it could just be a town centre or a particular area. So the neighbourhood plan is that more detailed focus. The local plan, longer term requirements for homes, jobs, infrastructure. Neighbourhood plan could be about, well, where should these go? What do we want them to look like? Where perhaps do we not want them to go in the area? What are the local issues? Is conservation important? Do we need to provide some detail about that? Local plan, the site allocations will look to allocate certain larger sites where their importance and delivery of the strategy of Cornwall. Neighbourhood plan can also allocate sites if it wishes to, but it doesn't have to. It's something to be explored. So neighbourhood plan, I think, could be a really positive tool, areas to protect, some more specific detailed guidance that perhaps won't exist in the Cornwall local plan. But really, the neighbourhood plan could contain as much detail or as little detail as you want, really. It's up to you, through asking the wider community what they think is important, to decide what goes into the plan. This slide was not specifically for this presentation. It was part of a slide that's been used in other presentations on neighbourhood plans, because you're already doing a neighbourhood plan in St Ives, but neighbourhood planning isn't compulsory. You don't have to do it. Even if you're thinking of doing it, first ask the community, do you want to do a neighbourhood plan? if there are certain issues in the community or certain projects that need pushing forward. It could just be a matter of applying for planning permission to get something done. And as I've said already, neighbourhood plans could be a simple vision, aspirations for the community, or they could be more detailed. This is where we want change to happen and these are the sites to do it. Again, it could be in the form of a village design statement, a design brief, or it could focus on the town centre. So, I know some of you are perhaps quite familiar with those that information on neighbourhood plans already, but just the last couple of slides, just some thoughts in terms of local plans and localism, just to really finish up on really. The local plan, I think, is more about strategic issues in Cornwall, and the term that sometimes used is larger than local. It's those issues where you need to have a bit of a larger than local view to make sure that the decisions made are right in terms of infrastructure or climate change, or the amount of homes that may be needed across the board. So that's the local plan's role. I think local plan, some may disagree, but is a key element of localism within the built environment context, because it does set the overarching context for then the other areas of localism at town and parish level to take place. And I think without that larger than local level, the level below becomes very difficult. I think I showed that map earlier on with all the parishes and towns across Cornwall. If every one of those were producing a neighbourhood plan and there was no strategic overview, I'm not quite sure where it would go, to be honest, but it would be certainly interesting to watch. Localism, local plan, also localism with more strategic context. And just the other thing to say about it as well is that you're aware, planning, local planning, neighbourhood planning, it's a very political context, whether it's nationally, politicians, changes of government, they always like to tinker with the planning system. Cornwall Council, local authority, hugely political. At the town community level, it's a political arena and everyone has a view, and so that has to be considered the whole time when you're doing your neighbourhood plan, equally when we're doing the Cornwall local plan. But there's an election next year. I just wanted to say that with every new government, if there's a change of government, they tend to like to change the planning system. I hope there isn't, but there could be further changes if there are, and just a thought. Okay, last few thoughts, neighbourhood plans and localism. And again, as I said, some of these aren't necessarily Cornwall Council's view, they're just some of my views in terms of working in the planning sort of area and built environment. I think there are some tensions, and sometimes there are contradictory messages which come down from central government, that you've got localism aspirations and then you've got the pro-growth agenda. I think this can cause a bit of confusion at the local authority level, but also at the community level as well, in terms of wanting to use neighbourhood planning, but then being told they have to use it to be sort of pro-development, if you like. I think there's some tensions there. Again, I think there's tensions around housing requirements. Planning is about jobs and infrastructure and homes and green spaces, but it always seems to be about houses. How many houses are we going to have? Where are they going to go? And that always causes the tension in a lot of discussions. And I think you do need to have a certain amount of strategic overview across boundaries, across town and parish boundaries, to make sure that we're going to make sure we provide for the future community in the right way. Cornwall has 213 parish town councils, so I think it's quite a challenging area for neighbourhood planning, simply because there are so many, I don't want to say arbitrary boundaries because you get the wrong impression, but so many different boundaries that in some ways don't make sense for planning physically or geographically, but they're parish and town councils, and everyone wants to influence their area, but I think it is very challenging for neighbourhood planning. Local authorities have a duty to assist neighbourhood planning, which we do, but again, there are 213 parish and town council. Local authorities are having cuts ongoing year on year, and I think it is a question, how are we going to support? And there are other agencies that do support as well, but how are we going to do that in the future? Already, it's quite an undertaking. And neighbourhood planning, there's uneven activity. The resource question with cuts. Some of the areas are more affluent that we're undertaking neighbourhood plans. The areas perhaps that are more deprived, how do we address some of the issues there where some intervention is needed? So that's really it. Just last thing, so hopefully that's given you a bit of overview about recent changes to the planning system, the Cornwall local plan, the local plan in relation to this area, a bit about neighbourhood planning and some thoughts about that, and also just a few sort of my thoughts at the end in terms of the localism agenda, and happy to take any other questions or thoughts really at this stage.